Chapter 8. Don't worry, son. I've got some arson for you. Phil and Wilbur are able to make a good distance through the streets, with only a few stray zombies to pick off. The scuffle from before didn't seem to attract too many of the undead, and Wilbur is glad for that. Phil kills each and every zombie that comes near, but he's put away his gun, at Wilbur's insistence. Instead, he uses the very axe he gave to Will earlier, slamming the sharp edge of it right into the zombies' skulls. Wilbur gags a bit internally with each kill. Phil is efficient and quick about it, but it doesn't change the fact that it's gross. At one point, Wilbur gets ahead of Phil, eager to find the very street he was in before he got separated from Tommy. The buildings are familiar here. Wilbur knows them from running through here to try and escape the horde. The zombie horde that was here before is long gone, having moved along to somewhere else. Wilbur hopes that it stays far, far away. He would hate to be trapped in these buildings for a second time, with the echoing groans ringing outside as a constant reminder that the dead wanted to tear him apart. Wilbur speeds up his pace as he walks down the road, head turning left and right as he scans the buildings, checks the street signs. He rests a hand on one of the cars in the middle of the road, and he sees nothing for as far as he can see. Not a single soul, not a single survivor, and not a single sign that Tommy made it out okay. There's a plummeting feeling in Wilbur's chest that makes him lean a bit more against the car, but he moves past it, forcing himself to keep walking, pacing around the area with a wary eye, as if Tommy will pop out from the buildings at any moment now, ready to run into Wilbur's arms. "Will," Phil calls out as Wilbur backtracks for the fourth time, stepping onto the sidewalk and then onto the open road, turning around and looking up and down the street. "Wilbur," he calls again, Wilbur pausing in his steps to grab tightly at the front of his shirt. "Mate, you've been pacing around in circles." Wilbur doesn't answer him, but he's stopped moving, and instead he just looks around one more time, eyes wide with careful hope and slow disappointment filling his lungs. God, how he remembers the fear thrumming through his veins. Just a few weeks before, narrowly escaping death, undead hands grabbing at his sleeves, Tommy screaming out his name, ignoring their unspoken rule of staying quiet around holes, because he couldn't care less if the zombies were going to come closer. Wilbur had disappeared. Will had needed to run away. He had needed to run to safety, but in doing so, he ran from Tommy, and in doing so, he's Wilbur. Phil asks, close up behind him, yanking Wilbur right out of the crushing guilt and fear. "Hey," he says, gentle and careful, like Wilbur is something that's about to shatter. Will turns his head down the street, wiping his palm against the corner of his eyes. "This is where I lost him," Wilbur says, quietly, staring up at the nearby street sign. He remembers that day nearly vividly, because he repeats the moment over and over in his head, the whole time hiding away from the horde, trying to survive. He had simply just been thinking of what he could have done better, what he might have been able to do instead. Part of him wishes he would have just killed his way through those zombies, made a bloody path straight to Tommy. Part of him knows he would have never been able to, though. It's better for him to have been separated from Tommy rather than to have been killed in front of him. With this, there's still a chance Wilbur can reunite with him. Even so, it doesn't make it any less painful. Phil reaches out to Wilbur's arm, giving a small squeeze. "Sorry," he simply says, and Wilbur holds back the burning feeling of a sob wanting to rise up. He chokes it down and shakes his head, holding out a hand towards Phil for the axe in his hands. Phil gives it over, and the weight of a weapon is comforting in Wilbur's palms. "The horde that was here before has already passed, so that's good for us," Wilbur says, ignoring the slight shake in his voice. "I know the vague direction of where they might have gone after we got separated, but it's nothing definite." He trails off, biting at the inside of his cheek. "Why don't we camp here for the night?" Phil asks, tilting his head up towards the sky, where the sun has slowly started to set, light fading from the roads. "Maybe you'll find a clue of some sort as we rest." Wilbur gives an unconvinced huff, but he nods, simply because he honestly doesn't know where to go from here, and he just needs a moment to recollect himself and try to pull this all together. All right. They choose a sturdy building for their shelter, searching through the rooms for any stray zombies, and thankfully finding only one. Wilbur takes care of it this time, slamming his axe into its head with a bit more force than necessary. He hacks at the thing with a hefty swing, splattering blood all over the walls and floor, and chopping up the body into something pathetic. It's gross. It's disgusting. And it's something Wilbur needed, because he feels just a bit lighter. After, even with the blood on his shoes, Phil gives him a look of amusement, but he doesn't say anything, and Will doesn't comment either. They simply go to pick up a torn room on the second floor, 2 windows facing out towards the street, giving them a good view of any oncoming threats. One of the windows is shattered, a bit of glass scattered on the floor, and there's a hole in the roof that lets Wilbur have a peek of the stars. The ground is dirty and scratched up. The walls seem to be in the same condition, and all that's in the room is an overturned desk, a broken chair, and a small bookshelf to the side that looks like it's seen better days. This might have been some sort of office before. Wilbur sits down on the ground beside the wall, placing his axe to the side as Phil closes the door and drags the desk over to barricade it. When he catches Will watching him with a tired look, Phil gives a bright grin and a shrug. "Can't be too careful," Phil says, pushing the desk once more to make sure it's in place, keeping the door firmly shut. "We should be fine here till morning." Phil goes across the room from Wilbur and puts his bag down on the ground, choosing to lay his head on it and look up towards the ceiling with a calm expression. "Yeah." Wilbur pulls his knees up to his chest, resting back against the wall with his head tilted up, eyes glued to the window. The sunlight is slowly slipping away from the town, and the room starts to grow dark with each passing minute, night approaching fast. Both him and Phil just rest in comfortable silence, Phil at one point taking the time to eat something, before going back to just laying down and humming quietly underneath his breath. Will busies himself with organizing everything in his backpack, and he tries to focus on how many bars of food he has, how much water he's carrying. He adjusts his backpack and checks through all his pockets, eating a bit of food and drinking some water and trying to ignore the climbing fear in his throat. The room is dark, with no source of light, and Phil goes quiet, his breathing being the only sure sign that he's even there. It's hard to make out his figure from across the room, and Wilbur tries not to let his hands shake as he zips up his backpack and puts it to the side. He tells himself he's fine, and he takes the axe in his hands and holds it tightly, leaning back against the wall again. His heart beats loudly in his ears as he stares across towards the windows, trying to grab any sort of piece of light from the moon and stars outside. There's a small gust of wind that blows through, but it's not cold enough to make Wilbur shiver, just a slight chill. "Wilbur," Phil says, Wilbur jumping so suddenly that he smacks his head against the wall, and he groans in pain as Phil gives out a small laugh. Will squints towards Phil with a frown as he holds a hand to the back of his head. "You should get some rest, mate. We can keep moving at sunrise. Unless you want to sleep in." "No, I want to keep moving as soon as possible." Wilbur shakes his head, carefully placing down the axe beside him. "Sunrise is fine." "All right," Phil hums, seeming satisfied with that. They fall back into silence, and Wilbur listens to the very faint noise of Phil breathing. A couple of minutes pass, and Wilbur's heart only seems to beat faster with each passing moment. The darkness in the room around him is nearly suffocating, and Will can't help but curl in on himself and try to hide inside the sleeves of his own jacket. Logically, he knows this room is pretty safe from any zombies. This place is hidden away, the door is barricaded, and there's nothing to even signal that they're both in here. Even so, Wilbur still feels like he's too vulnerable, too weak, and his fingers curl around the handle of his axe. There's a tight fear curled up at the center of his chest, and he knows that there isn't any sort of chance of him falling asleep anytime soon. Not like this. Wilbur smiles a bit to himself, but it's something that's a little bitter. How funny, for him to be surviving in the zombie apocalypse, to be getting by with everything he's witnessed and seen, and yet the thing that's keeping him up at night is the very night itself. Wilbur, even with how sturdy he can be, is scared of the dark. That's a silly fear to have, especially in the apocalypse, but he can't shake it off, and as much as he tries to tell himself he's all right, it doesn't take away the dread that sticks to his shoulders. He's tired, for sure, and sleep calls for him to lay down and rest, but his head screams that something bad will happen if he does so, and he can't feel safe with how dim it is inside this room. He's not sure how much time passes, with him just staring into nothing, one hand on his axe as he stays weary, even while half asleep. But eventually, Phil moves from across the room, and Wilbur lifts his head up with a jolt, hearing Phil shuffle around, and then, after a few seconds, stand up. "Phil?" Wilbur hesitantly asks, heart in his throat, a death grip around the handle of his axe. "You're still up?" Phil answers, and Wilbur's shoulders relax just a bit. "Or did I just wake you up?" No, Wilbur pauses. "I was just keeping watch," he gives an excuse. But it's weak, even to his own ears, and Phil gives a quiet scoff. "There's no need for that," Phil's footsteps sound out just from the side of the room, and Wilbur blinks with surprise as a lighter comes to life in Phil's hand as he stands beside the bookshelf. "You can just rest. You probably need it more than I do, with your head and all. How's that feeling, by the way?" Wilbur stares at the small bit of fire held in Phil's hand, the warm glow just barely lighting up Phil's face. As he grabs a few books off the shelves, Phil goes to throw the books across the room beside the open window. "It's fine," Wilbur says, holding a hand to the bandages around his head. "I've been feeling fine, at least." "That's good," Phil hums, throwing a couple more books until there's a small pile. He then holds one book in his hand as he walks over to beside the window, and he kneels down beside the books, ripping out pages from the one he's holding. "What are you doing?" Wilbur asks, leaning forward with curious eyes. "Making a fire," Phil responds, throwing loose papers onto the pile of books before lighting one of the papers and throwing it onto the pile, letting it catch and begin to burn. "It probably won't last for the whole night, but it should be good enough to keep the room while we sleep, at least." Wilbur can't help but stare as the light of the fire fills the room, and Phil himself is illuminated in front of the flames as he puts his lighter away, rising up on his feet and going to throw a few more books into the flames. Phil hums quietly under his breath as he gives his attention to the flames, and for a split moment, Wilbur looks at Phil and feels safe. It's there and gone within a second, but it's enough for Wilbur to let go of the axe at his side as he slumps against the wall behind him with a yawn. Phil turns his head to Will. "You can go to sleep, mate," he says, giving a small smile. "If you want, I'll keep watch, just in case." "No, you don't have to," Wilbur shakes his head, looking down at his backpack and considering if he really should try and sleep while he can, with the fire keeping the dark away. "We should be fine." "Good night, then." "Good night, Phil," Wilbur says, back slowly and carefully, and he looks down at his backpack once more, then decides to lay down, resting his head against it. He keeps his back turned against the wall and stares ahead at the fire for a little while, watching Phil sit back down at his spot. He doesn't go back to sleep, but he does take the opportunity to eat a snack, and Wilbur closes his eyes as Phil pulls open a wrapper, the crinkling sounding out against Will's ears along with the sound of the crackling fire. Wilbur closes his eyes, trying to sleep, and trying to will away the worries in his head. A few minutes later, something is thrown over him, adjusted over his shoulders, and Wilbur cracks his eyes open just a bit to see a glimpse of Phil walking back to his side of the room, his coat missing from his shoulders. Wilbur doesn't think too hard about it, just closes his eyes again, drifting off into sleep.